Altro, manca, vederci. Ah, ok. Bravo, sai che non me lo ricordo. Per esempio, ora non ce l'ho, c'ho crema.
I'm Wendy Holloway, and you're listening to the Flavor of Italy podcast, sharing the very best of Italian food and wine, lifestyle, and people. Greetings, everyone. I'm here today with Christopher Beckman, and honestly, I've been trying to get Christopher on my podcast for 4 years. It was actually in February of 2021. I first asked him to be on the podcast because he has this wonderful Instagram profile, The Happy Anchovy, with great photographs and stories, and it's just delightful. Both of us, both Christopher and I, adore anchovies, so it just made so much sense to me. But already Christopher was working on his wonderful book, which I'm now holding in my hand, and I love it, Twist in the Tail. And it's all about anchovies. Just a very tiny bit of background about Christopher. He's from San Francisco, so he's American, and has a doctorate in archaeology. This is his first book. And my question is, where did this passion for anchovies come from?
Hi, Wendy. Thanks for having me. And that's actually a very interesting question. And it started when I was younger, I was in my 20s, living in Los Angeles, flat broke, as many of us were at the time. And often when a group of friends would come over to dinner, I would prepare something to eat. And of course, being flat broke, that usually meant some spaghetti, a can or two of tomatoes, maybe a little garlic. And the one thing I knew I could do was slip in a little anchovy to bring a little flavor to the whole equation. And I noticed that if I mentioned to everybody before they ate that there was some anchovy, right away I would get some off looks, just reject the whole meal. So that was the first time that I noticed that there was something going on with anchovies.
What made you think about adding anchovies to a recipe? I mean, it's a wonderful umami ingredient and just fabulous. But for a San Francisco born guy living in LA, what in the world made you think I'm going to throw anchovies in here? Why not some other ingredient more familiar to Americans?
Sure, sure. Funny enough, I had a friend, an older Italian gentleman in Los Angeles named Sergio Premoli, and he's quite the character, absolute eccentric. And he had showed me one time this trick with anchovies, that you could just slip an anchovy into something. And he told me, he's like, Chris, just add an anchovy to anything and it makes it better. And it stuck with me. And I tried it. And sure enough, it was just this little gold mine. It was just this, suddenly something sparked. And I knew I had a new way to approach food.
One thing I use a lot in so many recipes, is anchovy paste. And I have a Secret Santa thing that I do with a group of friends, and you kind of pick what you want. And I picked anchovy paste. And the person that got my name said, that means you're going to have like 15 tubes of anchovy paste. Is that what you mean? I'm like, that's what I mean. So yeah, it's a great ingredient in so many things. So it came from an Italian, no surprise.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
But as you say, a lot of times when you tell people what's in a dish, it really conditions how they feel about the dish. So sometimes it's better not to say anything at all.
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
In fact, as an aside, and it says on the cover of your book, Nigella Lawson, who we all know is a wonderful culinarian, British, she says this is a must-read for anchovy obsessives, which I am. And in cooking classes that I run, I have anchovies in lots of recipes. And as you say, people are like, ooh, I don't like them. But they're thinking of maybe having anchovy fillets on a pizza. I don't know what they're thinking, but then they do come to realize that it's an ingredient that elevates food to the max. So your book covers Spain, France, UK, USA, and Italy. Why did you only choose those countries and nowhere else in the world? Because it would have been too exhaustive of a publication?
Well, partly, yes. And actually, early on, I had written some chapters, one centered in Peru, because Peru is the largest anchovy fishery in the world, actually number 2 by volume in the world after the Alaskan pollock, which is huge. But really, those are the big anchovy consuming countries in the West. Again, France is the kind of the northern limit. Above France, you really get into what I call herring country, where herring really dominated culinary history from the Middle Ages to the present in Northern Europe. But it's in the South, primarily in Spain, Italy, France, and then curiously, the British in England, where anchovies really came into play. And one of the things I find so fascinating was that each one of those countries approached anchovies slightly differently in their cooking. And what I mean by that is that in Italy, they consistently consumed anchovies from the Roman era right up to the present. And there were critics throughout Italian history who talked about, anchovies were bad for you, don't eat them. These are mostly elite doctors, aristocratic doctors. But anchovies weave in and out of Italian history more consistently than any other country. And for instance, France, in the South along the Mediterranean, always consumed anchovies. But anchovies really began in French haute cuisine in 1651 with the publication of Pierre Lavrenne's cookery book. And that's where he introduced the idea of butter and cream and sauces, and anchovies made their way into those sauces. So through the 1700s and 1800s, anchovies absolutely rode a wave in French haute cuisine in their sauces. And then they died out, probably coming to an end with Escoffier at the turn of the 20th century. England, by chance, used its anchovies mostly in condiments, things like A1 sauce, all the different condiments you think of.
Worcestershire sauce.
Absolutely. These are huge sources where they put their anchovies in England. The odd duck out of all these countries is Spain. And that is, when we think of Spain, we think of tapas, and the Spanish are mad about anchovies. You go into any bar now and there are anchovies everywhere. But ironically, 100 years ago, the Spanish really didn't eat anchovies. They were very late to the anchovy game, which is a whole nother story. But what's interesting is that each one of those countries approached anchovies very differently.
And what about Portugal? Because I was just there last spring and they have so many wonderful small fish in delightful little cans that are aged and wonderful. And I would have thought that you might have covered Portugal in your anchovy. Yeah.
I did, and we ended up taking it out because most of that history I could kind of cover through the Spanish. So, for instance, the Portuguese, they had a huge Roman port called Setúbal, just south of Lisbon. And actually, they had through archaeology, they've uncovered up to 25 different garum factories. And garum is basically ancient Rome's version of fish sauce, modern fish sauce. So a lot of that Portuguese history, I could capture more in the Spanish chapter. I do make reference to Portugal and Portuguese anchovies, but really I tried to concentrate it on the key players. Likewise, Greece has historically also eaten anchovies, but the publisher and I kind of decided it was better to really focus in on the key countries.
Yeah, yeah. Now, your chapter titles, and you approach the book where you have like lots of history and everything, but you approach it by country. And each of the chapter titles kind